25 years. We have Dilip Ranchekar, who has been with the Azim Premji Foundation, another organization set up for the purposes of trying to influence policy in both in its conceptualization, visualization, as well as its implementation. And I'm also the speaker and also the chair of the session. I have worked in Eklavya, I worked in Vidya Bhavan, and now I'm working with the Azim Premji University. So we hope to try and talk about this, and there would be a lot of us here who may have experience of making similar efforts. So we'll try to have some time for discussion and comments as well as questions. So we'll start now, and since we have about an hour and a half, so we'll start with Arvind, and I'll request them to restrict their presentation to about 20 minutes.
This is a little fairly difficult kind of area to reflect back and do. And I feel sometimes I think what should one really say? You can talk of many kinds of things, many kinds of influences, what all. So I have made a choice, slightly, little bit of a drastic choice, maybe for my own reasons, one time. One is, I think, since we worked with Eklavya for a long period of time, and we work very closely with government, so we've seen both ends where you think that you had some impact on policy, and also where you feel that there has been actually no impact at times, and or no impact in the sense that it's a very it's not a very easy angle to catch, because that impact is not something that always will last. It may work for some time, then will not be there. So I've been thinking looking at first I'll just take 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes, just briefly to recapitulate the kind of work we've done, and then I'll get on to what I'd like to discuss, what I've titled the thing as Where Have We Failed? And I think the time has now come to look at, you see, like in experiments or other things, you look at where you think it hasn't worked, or what has been the failure. The failure is not just me or X or Y or larger things. And if you're able to analyze failures properly, I think we will be able to add what the freshness is. So my basic thing is to look at where we failed and to see what new questions could emerge. And that's that is the real thrust of the presentation that I thought. So one, of course, just to give you a very brief background, many of you would be familiar. Eklavya started off by working with the, actually got formed in the process of the Hoshangabad Science Teaching Program. And that set a certain pace, and followed that with the social science and the primary school program. All of these programs had a very clear intention of impact, though at the same time people working with it knew that it may never work so linearly. It's not as if. So at one stage our programs were called from micro to macro. So the program would be something that you tried out in a small set of schools, as an experimental stage, 8 schools, 10 schools, maybe 15 schools, and then you went on to a district or block level. So the intention is that this is a model that you can work within the government school system, and it can work as a public school model. And that was the whole intention, that still is the. So the thing is that you begin with an experimental thing, and then you go on to a district or a state level. And that is the kind of assumption that all the programs follow. But everybody knew that it's never a very straight, not going to be a straight process, but yet that is the kind of goal that you set for yourself. At the same time, I think from very early on, we started working with out-of-school efforts, working with publications, working with communities on some technology, on some other forms in and out of school. And that started having an independent trajectory. Third kind of a thing is that post-2000, we worked very largely with state governments, starting with Lok Jungwish, then with Assam, then NCRT, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Kerala, Andhra. So there is a story of, you would see that it seems to be spreading, and yet there are many questions about it. So this, in a very nutshell, is what the small background is. I think there is some amount of literature that has been written up on this. If you were to read Social Science Learning in School, or if you were to see Sushi's book about Tasnif Ali, or if you were to look at a report brought out by Clever called New Beginnings, they do talk about this endeavor, and one would find reflections and repercussions of what HSTP tried or other people tried in many other programs. So I'm not going to get into where all you find the reflections there. I come back to my central questions to say, okay, where have we not worked? What have been the failures as such? Now this is a very difficult kind of a thing to tackle. कि किसको आप failure बोलेंगे या क्या बोलेंगे? So this is a categorization आप मेरे तरफ से ले लें. I'm trying to present this thing. I'm not trying to say कि this is Eklavya's point of view. But I'm trying to make this is how one should look at it. One, I think, in the present context, there has been a very large structural change. See, we worked for mass education, and mass education meant working with government school structure. Now you would see a structural change happening, where from 20-30% of people in private schools, now you're going to get almost about 60-70% of kids in private schools, about 20-30% remaining in government schools. You may debate the figures कि ये state में थोड़ा अलग है, वहाँ अलग है, यहाँ उससे ज़्यादा है, but you definitely see a structural change, and you don't see these figures coming down. किसी भी एक ब्लॉक का, किसी भी एक स्टेट के आप 10 साल के फिगर्स उठा के देखेंगे तो वो ट्रेंड एक तरफ दिखता है, तो you will start asking the question, where will this trend stop? To my mind, the trend might stop, as one of my colleagues cynically put it, at a place where people can't afford it. कि वो 20% तो अब ये तो दे ही नहीं सकते, that out of pocket expense. So probably from 20% in private schools, you will get into 80% or 70% in private schools, and 20-30% सरकारी स्कूल में रह जाएंगे as a residual thing. एक बहुत बड़ा failure इस तरह से दिखता है, because mass education of this nature stands on 2 or 3 things. Why is it that one gets so worried about it? One, it stands on the fact that there is a promise of equality. There is a promise of adequate funding for schools, and there is a promise of a non-fragmentation in society. ये 3 को मैं थोड़ा सा समझाना चाहूँगा. एक जो promise है कि you will fund adequately. See, you should understand that in 1950s, the directive principle of state policy said that you must have universalization in 10 years. It's not as if all policymakers or people did not know how much to spend. Every other country spent, but our own country had these actual spending as compared to ratios of GDP was very minimal, absolutely minimal. If you had spent much more, you would see a very different kind of transformations. And all of the transformations from Japan, Southeast Asia to others have come with
very large government initiatives and actually motivations to spend. So as late as 2006, when Tamas Mazumdar committee says and puts a target of 6% of GDP, we still seem to be cringing on it. ये ज़रूरत है, नहीं ज़रूरत है, क्या है? And the trend now is that there is, the thing is titled as the NGO impact on education. I think there is also an ideological divide here. There are a large number of NGOs who seriously, and you have to engage with them, who seriously feel that the supply to schools is not going to come from the government sector or should not come from the government sector. Yes, non-starter hai, chalega nahi. So you should actually bank on low-cost private schools as the schools that are going to reach the poor. And there is a very large section that actually supports this view. And so I think they have had a very great impact and we have not had. That is what I call a clear divide, and you can say that they have had a very clear impact कि actually spread of education, universalization करना है. So the strategy has to be on low cost private schools का spread और इसको आप बढ़ावा दो और इसको पूरी तरह दो. Government on the other hand has had a very indifferent kind of a role and sometimes a covert retreat. How do you recognize indifference? आप indifference को कैसे पहचानोगे कि हाँ ये कुछ कह कुछ रहे हैं और कर कुछ और रहे हैं? You will grab, one is of course, if you actually see figures, you will see decline in education spending. If you talk to some secretaries of education and you talk to them recently about the cuts in the SSA budgets, you will start understanding कि ये क्या है. Second is, in all areas of reform, in all other sectors of reform post-liberalization, the government has had a proactive method for reform. Sir, if you take banking, if you take insurance, if you take any of the economic activities, infrastructure, what, it's actually had a very proactive role कि reform में क्या करेंगे, क्या नहीं करेंगे, किसको competition में लाएंगे. Here, it's a totally indifferent role. You don't see a proactive role of the government in that reform. And how do you make this out? You make this out by seeing what is the actual phenomenon, abhi kya ho raha hai. You will find a large number of, for the first time in 60 years, schools in rural areas, government schools in rural areas are closing down. This has never happened. 60 साल बाद आप बिल्कुल ये अब दूसरा ट्रेंड देख रहे हो कि सरकारी स्कूल बंद हो रहे हैं और आज जब आप पूछोगे तो people will say ये these have been closed down because वहाँ बच्चे नहीं हैं. But the point is that it made no effort to populate the schools, and once the people have left, it seems obvious that that school doesn't have enough people. This school has let's merge them, let's close that down. So when people look at that kind of phenomenon, obviously the preference for private schools is a very natural kind of a thing, because you will find that there is no effort here to populate it or to improve it. It's the same bureaucracy that gets very complex tasks done by the same teachers. Census operations, polio operations. If you have ever witnessed polio, BLO teachers being as BLO in censuses or in the elections, you will see fairly complex tasks done by them. In any other kind of thing. But it seems that when it comes to just running the schools, it's a given up thing. So that is what I call a real indifference in Swaraj. So from this kind of this is the real failure that you see, that the mass education system structure has changed, and I think there's nothing we've been able to do as a policy impact to stem this tide. It might just go all the way up. And I think it is fueled also by ideologies that say that this is what is actually desired. How do you think of the new questions in this situation? I think that I'll come to. I'll leave it when we have a discussion round, I want to get into. But this, I think, is one very strong sense of thing that where is this? Second, I find for the last 15 years, we work with a large number of state governments on textbooks and curriculum reform. If one were to label what is the impact that one has, at a positive level, there's a great impact in the sense of saying that we've been able to put up examples, exemplaries, templates of what could be different. And I think there we have contributed, not just us, I'm speaking of many groups who have participated, not just Eklavya as this thing, but many groups and individuals who have participated have been able to put this up. There is a possibility of having very different curriculum materials to work with, to deal with. And I think as possibilities and as a widespread this thing that has been really expanded. That has really expanded. I don't remember in the 80s we've been called to so many states, whereas post-2000 we've been called to 10 to 15 states, at least 10 states. So there is some churning that has happened. Yet the curriculum reform here is extremely fragile and short-lived. This, I think, is the essence of the failure. Let me explain this a little bit. In the older Eklavya programs, working on textbooks, working on teachers, and working on assessment all had to go simultaneously. The strength of the program lay in their simultaneous operations. And the fact, and the advantage that you could come back to the same group and keep working on it. But this simultaneity and working long run was its real strength, not just new materials, working with teachers. In all these endeavors, working with teachers has taken a total backseat. And it's always stated that we want to do it, we want to do assessment, we want to work with teachers, but somehow it has taken a total backseat for two different reasons. I mean, Hardy and others would have can look at it differently, but I see two separate reasons. One, I think the state wants to take onus for this work, which I think is very fair. In our own experience, I think for years we struggled कि सरकार इसको अपना प्रोग्राम नहीं मान रही है तो आपका प्रोग्राम है. तो इससे क्या होता है कि when governments don't accept this as their own programs, they don't put any, the onus is not there. You don't see that sometimes. So definitely there's a shift of onus which is I think very healthy and should be done. But with the shift of onus is also that we can't, the number of teachers that we have to engage with is huge. It's no longer 500, 1000 this thing, it's like we have to engage with 20,000 teachers, 30,000 teachers. But I think there are ways of doing it, but they have actually shied away from that kind of engagement. Let me give you a small example even after the NCERT thing. When we approached the KV Sangathan, that you work with a large number of this thing, the new books have come out, let us work with them. They said, हाँ सोचेंगे कुछ हो सकता है. हमने कहा आप 20-20 दिन की ट्रेनिंग करते हो, आप हमको 10 दिन दे दो, अलग-अलग एक ग्रुप से, and we will work on the new materials and all. But actually they resisted. Very politely after, since I went to them 2-3 times and this thing, very politely they said, you let it be, we'll manage this on our own. Then of course my colleagues also said, why are you trying it? Can't you sense कि what do they want to say? It's not you've done it now, that is something they'll handle. So actually that is something they want to handle, but there's no engagement. So if there's no engagement of teachers on the new perspective, it over time starts giving rise to a very different kind of a phenomenon, which I call, see there are two movements from Krishna Kumar called textbook centric phenomenon. ठीक है, आप सबने पढ़ा. उसके बाद दो तरह के होते हैं कि you have a textbook centric phenomenon and then a lot of us will say let's go beyond textbooks. कि textbooks बनाए, so let's populate it, let there be reading materials, let there be libraries, let people will start using materials, and let's not let the textbook not be restrictive. Let you open the world, but begin from the textbook platform. So that is the positive shift up. There's a negative shift down. Recently, one of the teachers in a I won't name all the things, but said, "Sir, do you actually think ये बच्चे और ये teachers आप ये किताबें पढ़ेंगे?" So basically, what he's trying to say is that people are going to read guides. So from textbook centric, this thing, if you're moving to guides, these textbooks are going to be just showpieces. तो एक जो कबीर जी ने कहा कि निंदक साथ राखिए, तो मेरे एक मित्र ने कहा कि हाँ ठीक है निंदा करने वाले था, तो उसने कहा ये सब आप जो कर रहे हो अच्छे शोपीस है, सरकार भी बहुत खुश होगी, आप भी खुश होंगे, वो भी खुश होंगे, बट ये इसका कोई ये पढ़ने वाले नहीं है, पढ़ने वाले कुछ और ही पढ़ेंगे। आप सोच रहे हो कि आप कुछ चीजें बना रहे हैं। तो मुझे लगता है आपके ज़माने में that once we are looking at this, it is not something unreal. The kind of guides that are being used, the kind of actual classroom transactions that are being done, maybe this curricular reform route has reached a plateau or has reached a place where some other routes have to be thought of. This route is not going to work with new questions anymore. And maybe because I've worked so long and people say, "यार यही तो तुम करते थे, अब बोल रहे हो कि इसमें से कुछ नहीं निकलेगा." But I think there is a point to re-examine and think whether this route is going to deliver. You have to have some other routes. I'm not saying you have to give up curricular reform work. You have to still do curriculum reform work, but probably not in this way. What other way will come to? 2-3 minutes more. So first I thought was the structural kind of mass education shift where I think we have failed. Second, which I think is in the curricular reform, this thing, trying to use the textbook pedagogical route, I think has reached a plateau, a limitation. And different things should be talked about. That's the sense कि ये अब इसके आगे ये ऐसा नहीं, it's not going to deliver. Third, I think is जो हम लोगों ने हमारे जहन में हमेशा था, बट कभी नहीं सोचा भी था, बट their strength is very strong. What I call social norms. थोड़े social norms. I don't know whether I'm being technically accurate or not, but let me take 2 examples. One from the social sciences, which I'm very familiar with. That we made social science textbooks. Then we, as you said, from micro to macro, we tried. Obviously, government said, हाँ सोच रहे देखेंगे करेंगे, but they never came up. I think in social science you find 2 very norms that actually wipe out all that you try to do. Why I'm saying it, that in today in Madhya Pradesh, if I open the textbooks that are used in that state, it's absolutely similar to where I started off in 1986. तो आप कह सकते हो 30 साल के बाद आप वहीं के वहीं खड़े हो, पता नहीं क्या किया आपने. अब क्या किया, we let history judge, but if I look at what are the social factors which tend to wipe out all these things. So I'll try to figure out 2 for social sciences. One, I think, is the nature of the discipline. The popular imagination in teachers and for a large number of people who come out of college for social sciences, the popular imagination that this is a discipline that caters to general knowledge. And the purpose of the discipline is to impart some kind of a general knowledge in a logical manner. And actually we had one teacher in Indore who argued with us for almost 1 year. And it was not as if because she actually practiced this in her school for 10 years. So किसी को अगर बहुत लगेगा कि and that's when we realized it is so deep, what we might dismiss of the thing. So the whole perception of social science is of a mini encyclopedia of this thing. Now when you bring a very different kind of a perception, this imagination has not actually come about. But it's not come about in among teachers, among the mass of people who study social science, undergraduate social science. So the whole world is centered around that perception, and that smothers your work all the long, or you have to counter it. So at times I think they become strong, at times where you have some moga, you become this thing. But in general, I think they are on the winning side right now. Second perception on social science is that everybody understands that this is very interesting but also contested. सब कोई कहता है कि नहीं ये तो बहुत अच्छी चीज़ है, पढ़ानी चाहिए, इसमें तो बहुत है, और थोड़ा बहुत भी खोलते हो तो you will find so many people engaging, because it's something that touches their lives and all. But at the same time they say it is contested, इसमें conflict है. वही the same people who will argue, talk with you, as soon as you say कि हमें एक chapter लिखना है, साथ में ये जो बात कर रहे थे, they'll say नहीं chapter लिखना है तो फिर ऐसा नहीं हो सकता. It goes into the worldview of saying what will be non-contested. If you were to pick up a non-contested area of social science, you will only land up by quoting you will land up with snippets of information, or you will land up quoting the legal position. कि ये तो कानून ने कहा है, सो बहुत ज़्यादा कुछ contest नहीं कर सकते. If you pick up the constitution, or if you pick up this, or if you pick up what Panchayati Raj should be, I can quote from the actual text and say this is what it said, and assume that life is as it said. So this view of social science, that it should be non-contested, leads you to a very different view, and that sort of wipes out whatever gains that you think you make. Similarly, in sciences, I think there are two norms that really maybe I'll come back to that in the question. So basically, to summarize, I've been thinking of, one is a structural change in this, second is the fragile nature of working with curriculum, and third is you have to grapple with very deep-seated norms, which are very different from the perspectives that you come with. I think these are this is the sense of failures that I could define as such. Thanks a lot.
So good evening, and pleasure being here. Arvind, your name gives you an advantage. A for Arvind, so he starts first. So looking at the numbers here, I got reminded of my experience about 7-8 years ago when in Indian Institute of Science I was invited to speak. And when I entered the hall, I saw some 14 people. So I asked Professor Rodal Narasimha, so only so many? He said, don't worry, about 7 of them are Nobel laureates. So it's not really the numbers and the quantity, but the quality that matters. I'm assuming that all of you are deeply interested in this subject, and that's why you've chosen to be here. Government is a very interesting entity. It is no different than a very large, reasonably fragmented kind of an organization. So there's nothing special, there's nothing only negative about the government. Let me present to you in very brief what is government to us. Government has certain constitutional obligations, especially in the context of education. It is even more so. Government is a democratically elected entity. It has a certain legitimacy, it has a certain mandate, it has a certain social awareness and social responsibilities. It also has resources, because it has the ability to tax all of us and create resources if it is required. You must have seen this in the context of education. The education cess, now the Safai cess, all kinds of cess get added. And they're nothing but really government's attempt to generate additional resources. So they have that ability. Vidya Bhavan or Eklavya or Azim Premji Foundation don't have that ability. The last one in this context is actually they have the human resources. They have the budgets and they have the experience. Now, how valid is this experience? How competent are these human resources? those are big question marks. There are question marks all over, in all sectors, in all organizations. These are some of the strengths of the government. Because especially if I give you the example of budgets and resources, no single organization or even conglomeration of all these 45,000 NGOs that we have can even match a percentage of what the government spends on education every year, which is close to $75 billion, about 3,24,000 crores, etc. Now, that's a very important thing to understand. Government has the ability to institutionalize certain things and scale certain things. And all that happens because of the kinds of human resources, kinds of institutions that they have created. Let's talk about some of the downsides of the government because of the way it operates. Number one is actually when you are dealing with the government, now I am actually saying in the context of the specific topic of this particular session. When you are dealing with the government, you are dealing with them for several purposes. But many people deal with them to influence the way the policies are designed. In some cases, we work with them, or what we expect from them is additional resources to be allocated to a particular program which we think will demonstrate or lay down certain principles that will be helpful down the line. The third is that there are certain execution areas where, let's say, some of us, some of the NGOs, want to influence and want to get associated with. We want them to help us in executing the projects which are either jointly designed or jointly developed or we want to implement. The next is that there are areas of the top management or the leadership of the education having committed, but on the ground doesn't happen. So we want their intervention to take cognizance of that and take appropriate actions to ensure that the decisions taken at the policy level, at the program level, are finally delivered. Incidentally, the whole issue of the quality of education, infrastructure, quantity, equity, whatever you want to say in education, is that of execution, the delivery. If you take the national policy for education, if you take the constitutional principles that drive the whole issue of education, if you take the national curriculum framework, which was evolved in 2005, and one of the unique things about that, no curriculum, no policies are perfect. But you can state these documents as documents that are fairly robust. They are fairly well-meaning and actually they only add to the fabric of the constitutional idea of the kind of society that we want to visualize. So the education, this education that has been articulated is supposed to deliver that. So many times, not many times, most of the times, this intent is never really passed on. This perspective is never created at the final point of delivery. Let's say this is a teacher. In 10 months, we expect to prepare teachers after a reasonably poor quality of graduation. And in case of D.Ed, again, those are all issues. I will not get into the controversies. Why should D.Ed teach primary? Why not B.Ed? I will not get into those points. But whatever you have decided, are you doing a good job of that? And why are you not doing a good job? So if you are talking about teacher preparation itself or teacher education itself, number one is that your curriculum never matched your intent. The moment you revised NCF in 2005, concurrently and simultaneously, you should have also revised the teacher curriculum. Incorporated all those nuances that were emerging and all the issues that were emerging into the teacher preparation and also in in-service teacher development programs and deliver that, but it doesn't happen. So number one challenge that we all face is that government operates in a very fragmented manner. And this is not only within education but overall. Like most of us believe that Anganwadis or preschool education should be an integral part of the school or schooling. You can call it schooling or whatever, but it should be an overall continuum of development. However, that belongs to a different department. So when just before the RT was supposed to be legislated, when we spent time with Shri Kapil Sibal and requested him several times that you cannot do 1 to 8 kind of grades. You cannot have 1 to 14. You have to have K to 12. He said, but that's a different department. I can't do anything about it. Let me go and do the RT first. But that is the consistent fragmented stand the government takes even among the development issues. And in education, you find the same, that each level is at a different trip. The Secretary Education, the Commissioner, the SCRT Director, the Diet Principal, the BEO, all of them have different priorities, but they don't get stitched together. So that's what I call as absolutely fragmented way of working. And this is a peril of a large organization. It happens in many, many organizations. The moment the organization becomes larger and larger, this is a problem that happens. The second issue is that accountability does not exist. If the SSC results of a particular district are 30% or 35% or 40%, that means 60% children failed at the SSC level. The national average SSC result at a point of time was about 45. It came to 49, now currently it is around 60. But that means 40% children are failing year after year. Who is accountable? Only the children. And at best their parents. There is no accountability. Why is accountability not there? Again, 3-4 issues. The issue number one is that there is no such system of measuring performance. Number two is there is a constant fear in the mind of at least the leadership of getting transferred in a very uncertain, undecided manner. So, you go to any state, you will find in 10 years there are about 12 education secretaries. In Uttarakhand, for example, is an acute case. In the last 5 years, there have been 8 education secretaries. The same secretaries have come back and gone out. Now, how do you the whole fulcrum or the importance of driving any vision of a very important issue like education rests primarily with the leadership. And the leadership has to ensure that things are designed, structured, delivered in a way that you achieve your overall goals. But that doesn't happen. So that's the other challenge. The two more issues in accountability which help in diluting accountability in a very significant manner is political interference. Just 1 month ago I was in the CAPE subcommittee meeting where the Principal Secretary of Uttar Pradesh was telling that I don't know when I'll get transfer orders. I don't know when a phone call will come and tell me you appoint this person or you transfer this person. So there is a general atmosphere of fear and khawf. How do you operate? Any well-performing entity, individual or organization operates much better if there is no fear. I mean, that's why we talk about non-threatening environment in the school and all that. So that is the other issue. The last issue is that there is no system of risk or reward. There is nothing at risk if you don't do anything. Once you get appointed as a teacher, you are a teacher. Unless you do something very silly and criminal, you are unlikely to be removed. Same thing is valid for the IAS officer who is leading the department. You can't. Because there is no performance appraisal system. If you are doing very well, there is no reward. There is no recognition. There is no good word. So this is the kind of system you are dealing with. Now, if you are dealing with this system, you have to deal with the system recognizing all these problems. Completely factoring all these problems in your work with them. So we were quite aware when Azim Premji Foundation got established, we were quite aware that this is a problem. But because we decided to work with the public education system, it was absolutely given. There was no other alternative but to work with the system. And also because of the scale that we had in mind, we said that scale will not be achieved unless you work with the system. So what are some of our learnings and what are some of our discoveries? And it is still, it's a continuous process. It's not that I'm just telling you what so far has happened. Number one is that we said that you need an entry in the government system. And this is the old saying of if you have to win the fort, you have to enter the fort. You know, you can't stand outside the fort and say that I have won this fort. So, and you require in that a benign entry. Something that is trustworthy, that is based on some kind of a basic belief in each other, that you will be helpful to us, etc. etc. So that is number two. Number three is you cannot ever go to such a large organization with a much higher experience and much higher ability than you, with a notion that I will solve your problem. So you can't go with any solutions as such. You can't say that I have a solution to your problem, I know what your problem is, this is the solution, and if we do this, then it will be solved. They will ensure that the solution will never work. So you've got to actually appreciate, analyze, and learn about the given issues, along with them, evolve a process for that, a valid process for that, and then you say that let's experiment this particular solution. It appears that this is what it is. And mind you, there is another very major side effect of this. This whole discussion and analysis of the situation is a very major source of learning for the government also. Because in their system they don't do it. And I realized it after I moved out from corporate. In corporate, for example, if you have 4 or 5 regions, sales regions, and it is very common to actually meet once in a quarter and review what the other people are doing and exchange best practices, etc. etc. No, I'm not getting into the issue of best practices because best practices is a myth. Because any practice has a certain setting, right? It has a human setting, ecological setting, cultural setting, money setting, whatever setting. You cannot just say that this is the best practice, I will implement it here. So therefore, I will not get into that. But the issue is that there is a merit in some of these principles. And those principles have to be understood, not necessarily the practice. But government, the whole structure depends upon a lot of rituals, a lot of hierarchy, a lot of non-questioning of many decisions that happen, a lot of implementation of decisions without creating and building that perspective. And then let's say, if you know about education, there was a movement on ABL, activity-based learning. And I still remember I was in Chhattisgarh in one of the places, and in the corner all the material was kept. I said, what is this material? They says, we are implementing ABL. And so I said, why are you not using it? He says, we don't know what to do with it. It has come 3 months ago. I said, haven't you been informed? Hasn't there been any discussion? Hasn't there been some basic introduction as to what all you can do with this? No. And this is not an exception, and this happens regularly. Things are ordered. Now ordered way of management works only in one place, and you know what that place is, which is army. You are not, by design you are not allowed to think. Okay? But in education process, which is such a deeper development process, it is so critical to involve the people who are finally going to interact with that all-important entity called child and facilitate certain development, certain enabling conditions, etc., etc. But that doesn't happen. So the teacher is the last important issue, and anybody can throw stones at the teachers. They don't come to the school, they don't work, they don't know how to do all kinds of things. You know, many of us work on the ground level, and that's not our strictly experience. There are, of course, cases where there are shirkers. Where there are no shirkers, tell me. In Azim Premji Foundation, there could be shirkers. In Wipro, there are shirkers. In Infosys, there are shirkers. There are people who float. So, that entire distribution curve is applicable everywhere. Yes? Shirkers, people who avoid work by design. Okay. So, I think you know the word, maybe the way I am pronouncing it, you didn't understand. So, so there are people of all kinds, but only the government teacher will get highlighted. So there are several such issues. So now what is the way to at least manage some half effectiveness? And the topic of this entire session is policy level, etc. let me tell you that policy level, I don't think we have been really successful in doing anything. Because policy level, let me give you two other truths. If today Sri Modi decides to do something, he will not be able to implement. He is having difficulty in implementing a simple GST. So there are members, I used to say that even in Wipro, that people think that you think that this is very easy for Sri Premji to decide and implement. It is the most difficult because he is most far removed from the ground. And there are people and people and people who will object to what he says. And they are allowed to object to what he says. So therefore, in that kind of a situation, it is not really today, for example, the present central government wants to implement so many things. Can it do it? They have an agenda. Can they do it? There will be huge problems. So they have to pass through several hurdles. So let's not even imagine that any particular individual or an organization will really influence policy at the state or the center level. We can only create positive ripples. We can create certain rational thinking. We can contribute to building capacity so that more and more like-minded people get generated from the ground level, and hope that they will eventually do the uprising and they will actually say that no, this will not work, this is what will work. If in a school, if there are 7-8 classrooms and 3-4 teachers are following a certain approach of teaching, the other 2-3 will be, in a way, in a phased manner, forced to take cognizance of what they are doing. So all that we are doing is actually creating abilities, creating consciousness, creating awareness, and creating capacity on the ground, hoping that that will eventually drive what the government does. And we have several examples of that. Several examples of that. Now, the final thing is that if you really want to influence what the government, first of all, there is no alternative but to work with the government, including, even assuming, though we don't admit that that will happen, assuming that the privatization becomes far more than what it is today. Because several other discussions reveal that the moment government implements the RTE fairly strictly and with a high integrity manner, requiring qualified teachers, certain salaries, all those things, it will be more and more difficult for the small scale private schools to sustain in C class, D class, E class towns. Because when at the larger level you have a situation where 70% plus people have an income of less than 3,000 rupees a month or $1 per day, affordability is a big issue. It's another matter that people are willing to sacrifice because they are convinced that education is the passport for their child's growth. But there will be a limit to that. They can spend up to 40%, 25% of their total income per month, but not beyond that. If the fees are beyond that, and they're bound to be. For example, in any normal government school, the average, let us take the average of the state of the country, the government is spending currently approximately 30,000 rupees per year per child, which means minimum fees that you have to recover is 2,500 per month. Can you imagine any school at the E class, D class level paying that kind of fees? Not possible. So therefore, it is not really possible to run a school unless you have shortcuts like paying 2,000 rupees, 1,500 rupees, 3,000 rupees to your teachers, having all kinds of teachers who are not qualified, may not be able to teach, but they come regularly and do something very regularly. That's a separate issue. I'm talking about the average schools. There are exceptions to all, both the government and private schools. So therefore, you have no alternative but to work with the government, because in most of the developed nations, public education is the majority of the education. And we cannot be the exception to that. So we have to in fact fight, and everywhere we are going and fighting and trying to create a fight. We must create brand government school, brand public school. Because in reality there is no qualitative difference between the public and the private school. Average public school, average private school. So why this difference? Why this? So English is a differentiator, aspiration is a differentiator, etc., etc. So how does the government school really counter all this? And how does it communicate what it does to the general population there? That's the big issue. So even if, assume that 80% schools are private schools, but the whole issue of teacher education, the curriculum, and many such things will remain in government domain. The constitutional responsibility of the government to deliver universal quality education will not go away till you amend the constitution. So therefore we have to willy-nilly work with the government. Government is the only operating organization that will in a way monitor, control, whatever you want to do. The education in general. So then we have to work with the government. We have to appreciate all the difficulties that the government has. We have to appreciate the limitations of working with a large organization, whether it is government or any other organization. We have to appreciate the fact that you're not dealing with the government, you're dealing with a given individual. The moment individual changes, approach changes happen. Topsy-turvy, completely topsy. We have to appreciate all this and we have to keep working. The most important thing is not to lose patience. Yesterday evening I was having dinner with the Bangalore Municipal Commissioner, and he was only painting a completely negative and bleak picture of what can happen in Bangalore. Okay, and that is our experience when we actually revised our approach, policy, and we want to do a large-scale work, etc. I must have met at least about 80 to 100 IAS officers who understood what education is, etc., etc. And they said nothing can be done. I said, what can we do? He said, nothing, you can't do anything. Nothing can be done unless there is an uprising. So that's our hope. So we have to keep working at the ground level. That is the only way. All those organizations which are thinking of meeting the ministers and meeting all kinds of glossy bureaucrats and intending to create some change in education will not happen. Thank you very much.
I'll try and put together what Arvind and Dilip have said. So let's first try to understand about transform. So I think what we understand is that we could be talking about radical changes in terms of transformation, and we could be talking about marginal changes, or we could be talking about reinterpretation in practice. So transformation of policy is a complex. So there are very strong basis on which we can't move away from. Constitution is one of them. And then there are some landmark documents which will essentially remain the same in spirit. I mean, 2000 to 2005 NCF was a shift in many ways, but in many ways it was a continuity also. So it's not as if the document, more documents in future, they will have different shades, different compositions, but there will be some basic aspects which will remain. And as Dilip said, the possibilities of government moving away from the responsibility of committing education to everyone, that is at the moment doesn't seem to be something which, although as Arvind said, there are some people, NGOs, who are arguing for government leaving that space. So it is also important to recognize that when we say NGO influence on government policy, there is we need to understand that the NGO space is also of a multiple kinds. We need to also understand what we mean by NGO. Are we talking about the only organization like Azim Premji University, the Foundation, Eklavya, Diganta, Vidya Bhavan, Vikramshila, or we also are talking about EduCom, education initiatives which are for profit, or we are also talking about Saraswati Shishu Mandirs, DAVs, and there are many other organizations which also are set up for organizational purposes, for education purposes, who have a vision, who also would like to have a policy statement and a policy interface. So as the government is fragmented, so is the NGO space. And I think we need to recognize that without that this conversation cannot move very much. As both of them have said, the space and possibility for direct transformation is very limited. I mean, it's not even there for the government itself and for leaders in the government. What is possible, however, there are windows of time where documents are given, where some things are being debated. At that time, intervening and participating in the process, and that could be in various ways. It could be becoming as a pressure group, which many people did at the time of RTE. It could be participants in the process of actually formulating the policy, or it could be in some other ways of doing, continuing to do your work around education, such that it influences the discussion in those committees where policy is being formulated as examples. So, there are various ways in which NGOs and their work can influence policy. So I think all of that has to be recognized, and those will only be effective in the tenuous windows when those opportunities arise. Otherwise, the only influence can be in terms of subversion of the implementation and the components of policy that you find negative. Because there is no other way to transform policy. So either you have openings when policy is being formulated, and then you may have different ways of intervening into it. And there are different NGOs who work on these with different mechanisms, and there are many. There are many examples I named. Some there are many others. There are actually people's organizations which work for children's rights. And then there are informal associations. So there is a whole plethora of organizations. There are institutions who do good quality research. They provide data, they provide analysis, which also forms a backdrop for policy formulation. For example, a lot of, what is that research called? So the randomized studies. So now that has made, they have made a very important area of work for themselves to influence policy through these experiments which they claim show the truth. So there are many people who hotly contest that, and they argue very strongly about it. So I'm just saying that transforming policy is a complicated agenda, and it cannot be simply pieced together in the experience of one or two particular organizations. So the more important things, I think, what we have learned is also in terms of implementation. We know that the government structure has certain strengths, which Dilip pointed out. It has a certain legitimacy and certain responsibility, which is unquestioned. If the Azim Premji Foundation decided to say that we will write down, because we are large, we are in 6 states, or Eklavya, which claims to work in 10 states, or Vidya Bhavan, which claims to work in 12 states, said that we will work out a curricular framework for the nation, and that curricular framework should be acceptable. It's not something which even will be worth raising in any platform. However, the government structures, by the nature of the constitution, by the nature of their legitimacy, are given that responsibility to do that. So therefore, one of the things that is important in what we have said is that the NGOs who are thinking of working with the government and transforming policy need to recognize both the strengths and the weaknesses of the government. Very often we go with the principle that we want to do what we want to. And we also go with the principle that if somebody does not think what we are saying is correct, then there is either something wrong with the government or with that particular officer. So there is also unwillingness to accept a difference in perspective. And I think that's one of the very important things that we need to understand when we work with larger public systems. Many of us are small organizations. We have a homogeneous personality, homogeneous way of thinking. But the government is working with a system which is heterogeneous, which has many ideologies, which has many pressures to contend with. So wherever we have found openings, and I'm saying that at a national level, NGOs have found major openings in this country to influence policy and also to set up implementation strategies. What we have ended up doing is that to make the same mistake as a bureaucrat would do. And I think we have made those programs and those interventions so tight and so bound that they have not left any source of flexibility and agency for the people on the ground. The curriculum has to be decided in a certain manner, the composition of the committee has to be decided in a certain manner without any flexibility. So the challenge of centralization which the education ministry faces, which policy implementation faces, the NGOs that have gone with their plans, and as Dilip pointed out, going through the ministers or more likely senior bureaucrats, have implemented an imposed solution on the system, which has had many positive ideas ingrained in them. Many of the structures have also been perhaps positive that have been envisaged in them. But the mechanism of implementation has been so watertight that it makes the people on the ground not align with that system or not find themselves included in what they are doing, and therefore have the same problem as that, what do I do with this material which is lying in my room, or why have these computers come to my room, I don't know what to do with them. So in a sense, the transformation of policy, whether it is in terms of on paper or whether it is in terms of practice, they cannot be separated from participation and agency of the people who are going to implement it. And I think somewhere that has to be a central piece in what we are thinking. Because if the transformation has to last, if the transformation has to be built into the system, it has to be built and stored in the minds of the people who are actually in the schools and in the education system. So somewhere the policy has to be something which they understand, they are participating in developing. It is not something which is not, cannot be a policy which is very well conceived, very well thought through, but something which they don't seem to be a part of. So I think this is a major question we need to think about in India. Ever since the independence, we have been on a modernization program in policy where we have tried to protect the secular, equitable, and the principles of, hallowed principles of Constitution. But we need to think back, sit back and think whether the policy implementation and the way it is played out requires some space for other players also to express themselves so that they are able to understand the validity and the importance of these principles, rather than having them imposed and squeezing out their actual ideas and thoughts. It's a dangerous idea to talk about, has always been a dangerous idea, but I think it is important to at least be aware of the fact that there is a need for opening out spaces for dialogue on some of these basic issues and to convince people of the soundness of these ideas and to recognize that in yourself that actually these ideas are what human beings will come to if they are allowed to discuss and debate. That by forcing them, you are often making them feel distanced from them. But again, as I said, it's a very difficult choice to make. Somewhere along the line, we have to think about how do we play this out and how do we allow actually one kind of imposition not to be replaced by another kind of imposition. Because the idea is that imposition is something which basically is against liberal thought. And education and freedom has to embed itself in free thought. So therefore, policy and policy discourse has to think about this question of what Dilip said, is building up understanding in teachers, in parents, in wider stakeholder groups about what education should be, and build from them some kind of understanding of where we want actually to move in terms of our policy. Thank you.